right, so if you are decorating your pieces, you have some options that are liquid, right? So I want to talk to you about slips. Now, one of the slips we're familiar with because it's just wet clay, right? So this is stoneware clay and this is stoneware slip. And I can add on some stoneware slip and create a texture, right? If I want to, I can come back through with tools and I can make this, you know, look really smooth, or I can paint with it. In fact, there's a bunch of really neat throwing videos of other people decorating with slip and creating texture that I'll let you watch. They're beautiful. I'm just doing kind of a quick version of things. But stoneware slip is not the only kind of slip we have. You could also decorate with porcelain slip. Now this is, so I've got stoneware clay and this is porcelain slip. It's just porcelain clay with water in it, just like the stoneware slip is. But because I'm putting it on the stoneware clay, the color contrast is interesting. So I could grab a brush and I could draw a pretty picture with my stoneware slip, with my porcelain slip. Or if you're working with porcelain, you could paint on with stoneware slip. So that slip itself can create a pattern, a drawing. You can also use stencils. So I've created a nice paper stencil here. To get a paper stencil to stick onto leather hard clay, you just get it wet, like I'm doing here, and that'll stay put. So now if I paint on here with my porcelain slip, I'm gonna have a picture outlined by that stencil. You can wait for the stencil to dry or peel it right off of there, and you've got your little decorated whatever it is you're working on there. Now there's another kind of, or a few other kinds of working with stencils where you actually add some texture. So I'm going to prepare this one, and the other one I've got partially prepared. I'm going to draw some carve some lines into my clay here. They're going to be really exciting lines. And then I'm going to put some of this slip in there. Now slip is clay, so you can get some thickness to it. I'm putting it in, filling up these holes basically with this porcelain slip. Now I've got to let it dry for a little bit, and I'm going to move on to this one over here. I've got some slip that's been drying for a little while on here, but I'm going to let it dry a bit more while I show you another another way that you can work with stencils. So I've got a wet sponge here, just sponge and water, and I'm going to get my stencil wet, but then I'm going to keep wiping. So if you wipe with a sponge, if you take a sponge and you drag it across clay, particularly across stoneware clay, what you're doing is in either case, you're removing some of the clay. With stoneware clay, there's also some sand in the clay, and that sand doesn't get picked up by your sponge, or at least not as much as the clay itself does. So what I'm creating here is a rough texture on the outside of this little paper stencil. That rough texture in the stoneware is because of the sand. I'm wiping away the clay and leaving the sand. You can do this technique with porcelain too, but you won't have as rough of a texture. What you will do is you're washing some of the clay away. I'm washing the clay away from the edges of the stencil, but the paper is blocking me from washing away the clay where the paper is. So it's subtle, it's a little hard to see, and I'm just trying to kind of emphasize it a little bit so it's easier to see, but you can highlight this with glaze choice so that that subtlety that shows up with the wet clay is more obvious. And you can keep doing it. No one wants to watch me do this for hours. So I'm going to grab a needle tool, which I don't have. I'm going to grab a knife, and I'm going to just pick this off of here. Cleaning off my knife, sorry about that. So you can be patient too, but I'm not being patient. So when I peel this stencil off of my little heart shape, the paper stencil has basically resisted me wiping away. You could do a similar thing with wax actually. Put the wax on, the wax resists you wiping away. So this heart is raised up and the texture around it is a little bit rougher. Is that visible? Now back to this slip that I put on here. I would like to have this totally dry, but I'm going to show it to you like this and we'll see what happens. We can always edit it if we need to. But I'm going to cut some lines in here, and yeah, they're showing up just fine. What I'm doing here is called Sgraffito, And Sgraffito just means scratching through. It comes from the root of graffiti, the root word of graffiti. I'm scratching through the slip to reveal the clay underneath. Now this is only going to work if you're working with wet or leather hard clay. You can't do that onto something that's been fired already. But this Sgraffito technique creates a really strong contrast between the two colors. Now I've done it really kind of sloppy. Here's a beautiful example of it being done. This is a little different than what I've got here. The clay is porcelain, and the slip that they used to create this was a black slip or an underglaze. But everywhere that you see, from here to here, everywhere that you see that's black, that's where the slip was painted on. And all of the white marks from there to there are where she's cut the clay away. And she just planned it out very carefully, measured, probably marked where she was going to start each of these bands and each of these lines. I would guess she drew these lines on, these outlines of the blank bands, whatever, while it was on a banding wheel. So it was probably spinning, and she drew those lines on. But you could take your time and do decoration like this using the Sgraffito technique and get it to be really beautiful. Now, my inlaid piece that I had over here also needs to dry a little bit more, and I'm going to kind of show, oh, you know what? I'll show you one more technique while we're waiting for that. So I have done Sgraffito. I have used a paper template, a paper stencil. I've drawn with the slip. I've added texture with the slip, and I've used a stencil to resist the slip. But there's another thing we can do, and here we're adding some texture. So I've been using Porcelain Slip, which is, you should be answering along with me at home, right? This is clay, porcelain clay mixed with water. This is stoneware clay mixed with water. And I'm going to add something here that is not exactly slip, but it's close enough for us to function this way. So I've got a bottle here of Underglaze. Now Underglaze is not glaze. That's why we call it Underglaze. It is not glaze, it is basically colored slip. All right, it's mass produced, it's fancier than the stuff we have in the bucket. We don't mix it ourselves here, but it doesn't melt, or it's not designed to melt at least. And it's got some thickness to it. You can apply this stuff at leather hard or at wet leather hard or after it's been bisque fired, just like slip. But I'm going to show you some slip trailing. So this is a slip trailing bottle. We have others, and you can put our slip in it. I just don't have one ready right now. This slip trailing bottle is going to allow me to draw some lines or make some dots out of this liquid slip. I can also, if I use a bottle that has slightly drier slip, like the porcelain that we make, and you keep it a little bit drier, I can make those marks stick up a little bit more. Mine are going to start to want to move on me just a little bit. I can see that they're starting to fall. I would recommend anytime you go to start working with slip, work on a scrap piece of paper or a scrap piece of clay to make sure that the bottle's working out okay. It's really upsetting when it's got a clog and it goes boom, and it all spits out on your clay. Now, a wonderful example of somebody using slip trailing is this, and we've actually got several of these pieces around the studio because there was a guest artist who was doing these. But this line and the line around the outside here is slip trailed. You can tell it's slip trailed where there's a little bit of thickness. He's also got some glaze on here, and so some of the running and stuff that we're seeing happening is the slip itself. I mean, sorry, the glaze itself, not the slip. All right, I'm about ready for my inlay, or at least we're going to try it out. Now this is where I cut some marks in the clay with a loop tool, and then I painted the slip into them. Now ideally I'm going to let this dry entirely, and I'm going to scrape away the surface. I'm going to do it here, and it'll mostly work. And you can see how those lines that I had inlaid slip into show up as very very distinct lines. It's basically the opposite of what we're doing in the slip tray, or I'm sorry, in the Sgraffito, this inlay. If I had waited until this was a little bit drier, my lines would have been cleaner. I've smeared it just a little bit. But you guys can do it. You guys can take a little bit more time, and you can wait and do those lines. Thank you.